Okay, so the main downloads today were included at the start of episodes, I think, what is it going to be, 23 and 4 um, on this chapter. So again, it's more about Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead. The introduction is going to be found in those two. So at the start of each of those, particularly the one just before this, there are going to be introductions that contextualize what we're talking about. I'm in chapter 7, which is called the Angelic Function of Beings. And I'm moving into the second section, which is called the Pathetic God. Basically, we've been talking about Corbin's imaginal world, the Neoplatonism of Proclus, and the sympathy with nature that is being suggested, that for me comports with McGilchrist's stuff about left and right hemisphere. And then a sort of alignment between Corbin and Jung in what has been called psychocosmology. And I realize that's a lot, but I'm just going to go back into it. Here, Cheetham and Corbin are going to be talking more about the relationship between the sort of Islamic Sufism that Corbin is pushing, and Christianity. And so I'm simply going to continue in the context of what's already been said elsewhere. Cheetham says, the pathetic God. That for the most part we do not live in sympathy with beings is obvious. And we've seen some of the ways in which this reveals itself. So by sympathy, he just means disconnection, right? Our disconnectedness. And there's a sort of imaginal style or way of reconnecting with things, with beings, with persons, or with angels, in Corbin's term, that they've been talking a great deal of through Proclus and others, including Ibn Arabi, William Blake, Surawadi. So how has our disconnection been revealing itself? Cheetham says, but it remains to examine from another point of view the crucial characteristic of the dominant form of Christianized consciousness. Quote, that is in large part responsible for this lack of sympathy. We've come to misunderstand the meaning and significance of transcendence. Okay, from the outset, I don't necessarily agree with what Cheetham and Corbin are saying, but I'm trying to understand what he's pointing to, and I'm going to continue. Is a claim that Christianity is in some way responsible for this lack of sympathy and that we have misunderstood the meaning and significance of transcendence. The transcendent God is so transcendent that it has disappeared entirely from the modernist consciousness. I would probably agree with that on the face of it through sort of Peterson and Jung. There's a way that the transcendent can sort of spiral off into abstraction and become so transcendent that we lose personal access to it. For Corbin, the disappearance of God, the process of secularization, was almost inevitable from very early in the history of official Christianity, from the moment when the doctrine of the incarnation was given its dogmatic form. But this doctrine itself is symptomatic of a deeper metaphysical problem. It's to the concept of creation itself that we now turn. Okay, that's quite interesting. So he connects the doctrine of the incarnation as what Corbin is saying is that the dogma that's associated with, as in the incarnation of Christ, that this involves a focus on the physical, the literal, the historical, at the expense of an orientation toward the symbolic and the transcendent, and direct personal connection to that. So it's again disconnection from gnosis. And I just feel that I th I'm wondering whether it could be a straw man to reduce the doctrine of the incarnation to that pole of the dogma. And I'm saying, well, presumably he's talking about preserving or restoring that the access to that personal connection to, through the theophanic vision to gnosis, to God. Um, and I think there are ways in which the doctrine of the incarnation is designed to afford that, and we wouldn't want to be blinded to that. But anyway, he wants to talk about it as a problem here, itself deriving from the concept of creation. Let's continue. Quote, the Christian understanding of the relationship of the creator to creation is a source of deep confusion about the status of the world after the fall. Christians were to be in the world but not of it. The stress is set up by the way this requirement has been understood, have resulted in various kinds of madness and the sundering of human wholeness. On the one hand, for secular technology in the world has been totalized, and any sense of limit is abandoned. Whatever can be done will be done, in fact, must be done. On the other hand, for many kinds of modern Christianity, not of it, as in not of the world, takes precedence in such a way that everything after the fall is fouled with sin and the filth of the earth. Sex is demonized, as are women. Wild virgin nature is to be feared and subdued, and the whole of creation is merely a testing ground, a platform of sin and temptation, and all our energies must be turned toward attaining escape velocity. Well, on the face of it, I would probably agree with a lot of that, which dovetails with Jung as well. Although how that derives from the doctrine of the relationship between creator and creation is not yet clear to me. Maybe it derives from a fundamental kind of misperception of what we're here for, what we're here in a way to do. But again, I'm attuned to the risk of straw man. But we see how this is taken up into, the techno-utopian stuff and, resulted in the need for Freud and Jung and the discovery of the unconscious. Like it's all very real issues that he's pointing to. He says, in the end, modern technology, the economics of perpetual progress, and a certain kind of world-denying fundamentalist religion all come to the same end. The meaning of earthly life lies in escape, and it is only the concept of the destination that divides them. All of this is what Corbin means by post-Christian eschatology. And we're so accustomed to it, especially in the United States, a country founded upon dispersal and expansion, that it may be difficult to see that what Corbin offers is different. A living experience of transcendence is the foundation for Corbin's sense of the world, but it is transcendence of a different sort. Yeah, okay, so we see how there's a connection here between, yes, the versions of Christianity that have really come down to us, I would say, some of them anyway, and also the expansionist mindset. So growth is good. It's that sort of stuff. It's the techno-utopian problem. It's Moloch. It's also colonialism as well as capitalism. It's expansion and growth, which is a different, it's cancer. Yep. So what he talks about that as going along with sort of on the one hand, um, the complete absence of orientation toward transcendence, and on the other hand, the a world denying fundamentalism, right? That it's all about the second coming or about paradise, about transcendence. I mean, look, there are definitely versions of the Islamic tradition that are similar. But anyway, Cheetham says, the origin of the specifically Western impulse towards the elsewhere, lies in the idea of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. We can see that in the Big Bang. So he thinks that this derives from the Christian dogma. Corbin says, the theological opposition between ens in creatum and ens creatum, drawn from nothingness. Try and find out what that is. Yeah, uncreated and created being, obviously. So he says, yeah, the theological opposition between uncreated being and a created being drawn from nothingness. An opposition which makes it doubtful whether the relationship between the highest being and the nothingness from which he causes creatures to arise has ever been truly defined. Okay, so the focus is on the relationship between the highest being and the nothingness from which he causes all creatures to arise. And that's never been defined. So to me, that's again another way of stating the relationship between three and four. Again, this is in a way, it's a Gnostic idea that there is a nothingness from which God creates. So God here would be connected with the archetype of the third, which is has sort of virtues that are about masculinity and transcendence, spirituality, heaven, um, ego identity, ego strength. Whereas the four is sort of feminine. It's the place, it's the void, it's the body, it's the unconscious. It's the great mother. It's the nothingness. So to me, the highest being and the nothingness correspond to three and four in Jung, so comporting with Pythagoras. And that's an old alchemical problem, and Corbin is pointing to another way of articulating the same problem. Again, he said the theological opposition between uncreated being and a created being, drawn from nothingness. Show this is a fundamental opposition between them, between being and non-being, essentially. Again, Heidegger. And the opposition between being and non-being. Quote, an opposition which makes it doubtful whether the relationship between the highest being and the nothingness from which he causes all creatures to arise has ever been truly defined. I would disagree with Corbin. I don't think defining the relationship is the right solution. I think that would be another problem. Because if you define something, I would say that you also define its opposite by implication, and that creates more duality. Don't think defining it is the right thing to do. Quote, this notion of a creation from nothing opens up a gulf which no rational thought will ever be able to bridge. Because it is this profoundly divisive idea itself which creates the opposition and distance. Okay, I think that the creation from nothing is itself an idea that is expressive of that distance. I don't think so. I think I would call this a misdiagnosis. I think he's obviously correct that no rational thought can bridge the gap between uh, being and nothingness, uncreated and created being, or being and non-being. So I'm agreeing. I don't think rational thought can bridge that. Obviously, and uh, but it's not that idea which creates the opposition and distance. That idea reinforces, it reinforces and exaggerates and accentuates and expresses that opposition and distance. But it comes from a deeper place than that doctrine, and that doctrine is a way of expressing it. I don't think it's it itself. That split about which he's speaking is not an idea. So in the same way that rational thought cannot bridge that gap again, well, I don't think rational thought or irrational thought can create that split in the first place. So I think that split it comes about as a result of a loss of it's a loss of something that's deeper than certain ideas, deeper than propositions. So I would talk about the way that we've been participating, the way that we've been practicing, or in fact, not practicing. And so I would talk about the change in our way of life that resulted from the invention of stone tools, and long before the agrarian revolution, when our lives were radically changed by the invention of tool making and disrupted by that, and that we lost access to the sort of original strands of human culture that I think it's reasonable to imagine that there are certain ways of practicing and being present and participating in life that don't have this fundamental split within them. But again, I don't think the relationship between being and nothingness, as expressed, for example, in Christian dogma, created that, but it does express it. So close but not quite. Cheetham continues. Creation conceived this way lies out of and external to the creator. This sense of reality, if not sufficiently compensated by a living connection between creature and creator, is a powerful source of conflicts and of a desperate frenzy in the search for that severed umbilicus. Deeply true, but I think, yeah, again, that separation is expressive of the fact that we're cut off from the source. It probably doesn't help, though. Again, there's a resonance with Groff, where in the sense that our cultures, our religions, and so on can be expressive of, you know, again, what is quite literally the fact that we're cut off from the mother, um, as well. Quote, to be sure, there's much in Christian tradition that seeks to bridge the gulf, and it's this to which Corbin is always drawn. This is evident in his feeling for the importance of Martin Luther's attack on the mediating function of the church, and his discovery of the significatio passiva, which again I take to be sort of a capacity for grace, cultivating a capacity for receptivity, for theophany, personal revelation. But it's not this living connection Luther sought that came to dominate Western consciousness. Corbin admits this with sadness that the religions of the book tend always to succumb to idolatry, dogma, and literalism. For Corbin, the bridge is tawil, again, prophetic philosophy, the transformation of the sensory worlds into symbols, into open-ended mysteries that shatter and gauge and transform the entire being of the creature. Well, very strong language. Its metaphysical grounding is provided by the experience of creation as theophany. Its metaphysical grounding is provided by the experience of creation as theophany, as the realization of divine compassion. Okay, so there's an interesting feedback loop between sort of the, let's say, the practice of Tawil and its metaphysical grounding, because in some way, I understand that the practice of Tawil is designed to lead to that experience of creation as theophany, but that experience also grounds it, the practice, existentially speaking. Again, through the realization of divine compassion. Quote, this is not creation of the universe of matter or energy, as science now conceives it, a single unimaginably vast explosion creating in an instant an expanding universe of self-sufficient physical substance and a primordial flux of energies, extending outward in quantitative space, evolving through time in a ceaseless evolution. That's just what science thinks now, right? This creator is not a maker of something from nothing, not an artisan shaping any stuff into an object, not a physicist whose distant abstract mind is structured by a theory of everything. There are no fundamental particles, no basic forces playing out through time. Those relations all are based on power, capitalized, distance, capitalized, and the otherness of creation, also capitalized. The God of modern science created something from nothing, established the laws of nature, and has kept his distance ever since. Okay, so this is sort of Corbin and Cheetham's way of understanding how science and its metaphysic is sort of derived from Christianity in a certain way. You could say inhabits the same sort of imaginal world that we've inherited from certain readings of those traditions. There's obviously something about that that's deeply true, but then obviously something about that yeah, there's a lot of risk here. So the basic claim seems to be that both the sort of cosmology of science, the metaphysics of science, and also the Christian metaphysic of sort of creation from creator, that they both are sort of grounded on relations that are conceived of as power-based, distance-based, and involving an otherness, the otherness of creation. And that's an interesting claim. I mean, I think they would probably respond that they have the person of Christ. Um, and so the interesting discussion would probably be the relationship between the character of Christ and the affordances that go along with with his revelation, and the relations that are based in power, distance, and the otherness of creation. But I'll have to leave that there and say, with Chetham, it's hard to overstate the contrasts between the feeling for the world that must accompany these conceptions and that implicit in the doctrine of Ibn Arabi. Corbin states, the leitmotif is not the bursting into being of an autarchic, aut, autarchic omnipotence, but a fundamental sadness. I was a hidden treasure. I yearned to be known. That is why I produced creatures, in order to be known in them. The origin, the beginning, is determined by love, which implies a movement of ardent desire on the part of him who is in love. This ardent desire is appeased by the divine sigh. Creation springs not from nothingness, from something other than himself, but from his fundamental being. Yeah, so that comports, by the way, just with Chris Beisch, LSD and the Mind of the Universe going along in terms of the sort of fundamental sadness or original loneliness in a way that the production of sort of forms is resulting from the sort of desire to be known in them. And to me, I would sort of language that as yeah, that's sort of the divinity which is both inclusive of and pre-existing the archetypes of three and four. And what I mean by that is that it's a the creator that is both creation and creator resolves that split. Quote, thus creation is epiphany. It is an act of the divine primordial imagination. Correlatively, if there were not within us that same power of imagination, which is not the imagination in the profane sense of fantasy, but the active imagination, or imaginatrix, none of what we show ourselves would be manifest. None of what we show ourselves would be manifest. To the initial act of the creator imagining the world corresponds the creature imagining the worlds, his God, his symbols. To the initial act of the creator imagining the world corresponds the creature imagining the worlds, his God, his symbols. Yes, but the question is how can that correspondence result in the gnosis or theophany? I'm asking the how question again, but I appreciate the metaphysical reorientation. Cheetham continues. The archetypal creative act is not based on power, but on love. The imagination in us is not manipulative, not coercive. It does not even engage in laying bare. We are not creators of what we imagine, if by creation we mean the act of a master. We are not creators of what we imagine, if by creation we mean the act of a master. To create is to love, to let flower, similar to Heidegger, to let something be as it is, phenomenology, to let something be as it is, to let flower. To create is to love. Not ens, not esse, but esto, not existence or essence, but esto, the imperative inauguration of being that grounds the meaning of the significatio passiva, that grounds the meaning of the capacity for grace. Quote, that is the meaning of himma, the thought of the heart. Real being is created not by thought, but by passion. Real being is created not by thought, but by passion. I gave an episode on himma in the New Gnosis series. Creation as imagination is founded upon desire, love, and sympathy. Symbolic perception, mystic perception, gives birth to forms, to things, to personifications, out of the depths of the mysteries of the heart. And these beings, thus lifted away from their entrapment in the opacity of the world, perceived as merely physical, have their true being revealed in the light of the imaginal world. Okay, so the idea would be that there's a deep connection between sort of imaginal practice, seeing the world in an imaginal way, and personification itself. So the revelation of beings, the revelation of persons, and also symbolic perception, the giving birth to things, and also releasement, Gelesenheit, if I've got that right. The image deified, the image thus created and perceived, is no phantasm, no fluttering wisp of spirit, is more real than any thing can ever be. Every theophany announces something other, which is more than itself. It is more than appearance, it is apparition. To me, that doesn't help, but that's okay. Yeah, to modern consciousness, apparition is synonymous with the unreal, but not so here. Okay, so apparition means something else. Quote, Tawil is possible because there is symbol and transparency. Because there is symbol and transparency. Difficult. Corbin says, this form itself presupposes an exegesis. This form itself presupposes an exegesis. Interesting self-reference. This form itself presupposes an exegesis that carries it back to its source, or rather, apprehends simultaneously on many planes, the many planes on which it's manifested. Sorry. Okay, so we were talking about the imaginal world. We're talking about the theophany, the revelation of the personal God, also the sort of the faces of things as apparition, which has a different meaning than normal. Basically, it's pointing to transcendence. Okay, I don't want to get too hung up on the difficult quote, so simply read the I'll read the yeah, what where Cheetham was at. He said it's a bit difficult to go back into. It's kind of like, well, he said the image thus created and perceived is no phantasm, no fluttering wisp of spirit. It's more real than anything can ever be. Every theophany announces something other, which is more than itself. It is more than appearance, it's apparition, but not as we normally understand apparition. To modern consciousness, apparition is synonymous with the unreal, but not so here. To will becomes possible because there is symbol and transparency. Corbin says, this form itself presupposes an exegesis that carries it back to its source, or rather apprehends simultaneously the many planes on which it is manifested. Without the active imagination, the infinite exaltations provoked in such a being by the succession of theophanies which that being bestows on himself would be impossible. I did not find that easy, so I'm going to move on. Cheetham says, the world of sensory perception becomes transparent. It can be seen through. But this is because what lies on the other side, what draws the world out of itself and has the power to turn it inside out, is more real, more true, more powerful than any of those realities, both autonomous and opaque, which make up the world of objects. The only true autonomy is granted by the One, which lies in the direction of heaven. Again, my orientation is to the how question. Quote, the realm of the beyond, the succession of heavens, is not populated by things. The inhabitants of these heavens are transparencies in perpetual return, perpetually opening, an ocean without a shore. That's just, yeah, a way of poetically putting the same. So he says, the world perceived in this way invites a fall into and through the world, which is in itself a return. This return is not a negation of the world, not a rejection or denial of a sinful state. It's an awakening to and celebration of the immensity of the true journey. So obviously, I like a lot of that because it includes, the way as journey. It includes the sense of a return to spiritual home. It includes a reimagining of the fall as a fall into and through the world and deeper into God, I would say, or the One, if you like. But this is obviously getting quite difficult, and I'm sort of out of my depth theologically, but I'll continue. We in the West have fallen prey to the catastrophic results of an exclusive emphasis on the exoteric meaning of the Tawhid. Um, yeah, so this helps to sort of explain some of Corbyn's biases, which I feel are sort of pointing too far back in the other direction. And there's a way in which he's sort of really emphasizing the individual and the Gnostic and the esoteric. And if we understand rightly, then it should be about the balance between the two. And yes, maybe the pendulum needs to sort of swing the other way again. Um, yeah, but both, right? So emphasis on the exoteric is not a problem in and of itself, but exclusive emphasis on the exoteric is, with emphasis on exclusive. So it is the oneness of God. So we've fallen prey to the catastrophic results of an exclusive emphasis on the exoteric meaning of the oneness of God. the witnessing of the unique, which is the assertion of the existence of a supreme being that transcends all of creation. Quote, this is the unintended idolatry of abstract monotheism. Abstract monotheism. A necessary counterpoint to this outer meaning is the esoteric tawhid. This reveals that the unique that is witnessed is in fact the unity of love, lover, and beloved. That's Nicholas of Cusa put it that way, I think. The Trinity as those three, love, lover, and beloved. So I think, yeah, if he's sort of identifying the sort of the existence of a supreme being that transcends all of creation as a sort of with the exoteric meaning of the uniqueness of God and a sort of abstract monotheism, and if he's offering the counterpoint, which is the fact that that oneness of God is in fact love, lover, and beloved, well, properly they would have to go together again in the way that esoteric and exoteric were supposed to go together. And that seems to point to a 3-in-1 structure with love, lover, and loved as three in relationship with the one, meaning of the one God. And yeah, through Jung, I'm like, yeah, the 3 and 4 thing, not, I don't want to default to the Trinity again. Getting stuck in the three is also a problem. Court, in the doctrine of yet another figure of that crucial 12th century, who is of great importance for Corbin's vision, namely a guy named Shirazi, God cannot be witnessed by an other, both capitalized. God cannot be witnessed by an other, since then there would have to be a creature extrinsic to God to witness him from outside. Cheetham continues, as he was saying, as Shirazi was saying, God cannot be witnessed by an other, since then there would have to be a creature extrinsic to God, outside God, to witness him from outside. There can be no other than God, and creatures are truly not other, but rather God's own sense organs by which he knows himself. For Shirazi, since, quote, God can only be looked at by himself, a world which wishes itself other, a world which wishes itself other is not a world that God looks at. This is so hard to make sense of this. God can only be looked at by himself. Since God can only be looked at by himself, a world which wishes itself other, either by agnosticism or by piety, meaning an idolatry masquerading as piety, is not a world that God looks at. Literally, it is a world that God does not look at. Tricky. Such a world must have come into existence in the first place in order that Nietzsche's tragic exclamation that God is dead can resound and spread in it. Why? Quote, thus the creation itself, as the realization of the divine compassion, the breath of the merciful, is itself the link between the human soul and the divine. And because it is a living connection, it must be active, continually alive, subject to perpetual tawil. So I have to say that all of this lost me. I get how we can't have a distinction between creator and created. I think that Christians would say that they don't in some way. I don't know. But I don't see how does that mean that the creation is the realization of the divine compassion? I guess that's just the divine compassion was earlier just sort of God manifesting himself as all these forms, which is like fine, right? Okay. But how is that the link between the human soul and the divine? It's not clear, but like it's fine to work this sort of thing out theologically as an objection to Christian dogma, say, but what does it look like in practice? Find that far more relevant in some way. Anyway, he says that he's basically talking about the third term or the between. He says because it's a living connection, it must be active, continually alive, subject to perpetual will. I don't know if it's active, it's also got to be passive. Continuing. This creation is a recurrent creation, not accomplished once and for all, such that we can at some time hope to know the ends of it. Right. It's a recurrent creation which it doesn't finish, doesn't end. Quote, creation as the rule of being is the pre-eternal and continuous movement by which being is manifested at every instant in a new cloak. Creation as the rule of being is the pre-eternal and continuous movement by which being is manifested at every instant in a new cloak. Okay? There can be no theory of everything in the cosmos as understood by Ibn Arabi, because creation is never closed and completed. Beings are not independent existence that can be known and manipulated, as if they are only what they are in the manner that we conceive of things. That's a little tricky. Is sort of there's a way that we also understand that our history is never closed and completed, right? So it's a way of taking that historicity and not exactly inverting it, but turning it 90 degrees, turning it to the vertical, so that verticality is never closed and completed. But to me, this is just sort of like there's a way of understanding things, and there's a way of understanding sort of life in the world, which is that we sort of never arrive at a final conclusion. We never really sort of get anywhere. And there's a way that sort of science is sort of saying, this is how things are, as if that was sort of always the case and always will be the case, and that that can be revealed to be sort of illusory. But the question would be, how can we, again, how can we feel that? How to practice that? Again, quote, beings are not independent existence that can be known and manipulated as if they are only what they are in the manner that we conceive of things. Utilitarianism, or our contemporary equivalent of engineering, is far too restrictive to be universalized into a cosmology because there can be no autonomous objects for use. Such objects are by definition dead, opaque, literal. Okay, I think he's connecting utilitarianism with sort of utility and a kind of engineering mindset, which he's basically saying that can't be a proper cosmology because the meanings of things are too restricted. And it would need more fleshing out. Like, what does he mean by utilitarianism there? Quote, this ceaseless creation is invisible to us. That's not very helpful, but anyway, this ceaseless creation is invisible to us. Quote, because when something passes away, something like it is, quote, existentiated at the same moment. Can we say brought into existence, meaning created? At every breath of the sigh of compassion, being ceases and then is. We cease to be, then come into being. In reality, there is no then, for there is no interval. For the effusion of being, that is the sigh of compassion, flows through the things of the world like the waters of a river, and is unceasingly renewed. It's the perpetual recreation. It's the renewing. It's the fountain. I would call that fountaining. Also resonates with Tao, but it's hard to grasp this stuff. Cheetham continues. And so the identity of objects and persons. And so the identity of objects and persons is not granted by their continuity in an illusory linear time, but rather comes from the eternal archetype or form, the principle of individuation of that being. Okay, so there's a way of understanding that sort of, as we put it, sort of objects and persons do have an identity in the sense that we consider in some way persons to be objects. And there's a way that this is grounded in time, that we're all objects in time, and we're objectified in that. And this comes about by regrounding things uh, in a way in eternity. So there's a way that the archetypes, or in a sense the forms, the sort of the principle of individuation of that being is, I would say, is grounded in eternity. So there's a clear relationship here between eternity and archetype. That's very interesting. It's not just that it's about leveraging time, right, in the way that's been talked about. It's about regrounding that sense of time in the eternal, which requires archetypal work, requires imaginal work. Cheetham says, at every instant, each being is created anew perpetually, and so ceases to be and becomes at every instant. This ceasing to be is fana, annihilation, annihilation, the disappearance of the one substance that is pluralized in its epiphanies. At every instant, each being is created anew perpetually, and so ceases to be and becomes at every instant. This ceasing, this ceasing to be, or annihilation, fana, the disappearance of the one substance that is pluralized in its epiphanies. The other side of this, the perpetuation of each being, is accomplished through its existence in the one divine being, which must, however, flower into multiple theophanic forms throughout all the planes of beings, all the worlds, terrestrial and superterrestrial. What? So I'm finding this to be one of the hardest sections of the whole thing, which maybe just points to my illiteracy or my ignorance, theologically speaking. But so anyway, I'm to understand that there's a kind of replacement of being with becoming, in a sense, and that involves an aspect which is sort of annihilating, and an aspect and also pluralizing, and also an aspect which involves perpetuating, quote, which is accomplished through its existence in the one divine being, which I kind of thought is it's I think the emphasis is on existence in the one divine being rather than created as separate from that being. Quote, which must, however, flower into multiple theophanic forms throughout all the planes of beings, all the worlds, terrestrial and superterrestrial, which doesn't really add a lot for me. Quote, this manifestation and annihilation occurs eternally, perpetually, instantaneously, and in all the hierarchy of worlds from the terrestrial upwards. The interpenetration of this world and the other means that, quote, this is the other world, or rather, this already is the other world. Okay? again, the emphasis is on how to bring this into view, how to bring this into, it's so tricky. This is the key to the secret of resurrection. There is a continuous ascension of beings, beginning with the untying of the knot of the dogmatic faiths, when dogmatic science gives way to the science of vision. I mean, of course I like that, but it's like again, you can't sort of just replace dogma. We need our dogma. I also, yes, there is something which is sort of about perpetual ascension, but again, the descent in the sense of anagoge, ascent and descent, and both are not really being emphasized here. It's I would say that it kind of falls into that dizziness of the heart that we were speaking of earlier. I forget where that came through. It was in the last video. There's a kind of intoxication of the heart. Let me quote that. It's like he said, quote, "There's nothing claustrophobic about this vision of the world. On the contrary, it may induce a kind of spiritual dizziness and intoxication of the heart." And that's exactly what I see here, is that it's there are some risks going on, or I don't know, it's not about risk, but I'm not fully comfortable with this focus on ascent and so on. Anyway, this idea of the knot of belief, the knot of dogmatic faiths, quote, is a metaphor found in Ibn Arabi, and some knowledge of his meaning can shed light on Corbin's use of it. William Chittick writes, and we're almost at the end here. The Arabic word itikad or itikad, sorry for mispronouncing that, which is typically translated as belief, derives from a root word meaning knit, knot, or tie, to join together, to convene, to make a contract. The eighth verbal form from the root, as a technical term signifying belief, suggests a knot tied in the heart that determines a person's view of reality. That's interesting. The Shaykh employs the word to refer to all the knottings that shape understanding, the whole range of cognitions, ideas, theories, doctrines, dogmas, prejudices, perceptions, feelings, and inclinations that allow people to make sense of the world. Beliefs lie at the root of every human thought and action. Okay, so this would definitely comport with strands of Buddhism and Zen. The idea is that that belief and the dogma of belief derives from a certain knottedness in the heart, which another way to talk about that is as the ego, I think, and that this was sort of derived into creator and created. So that was about the knot of belief. Cheetham continues, in the hierarchy of, quote, spiritual stations potentially attainable by humans, the pinnacle is the station of no station. From this viewpoint of perfect knowledge, it's clear that to every knot there corresponds a truth. Yet no knot is complete. Okay, so this is a way of sort of understanding the idea of knottedness or knotting, with epiphany as a sort of releasing of that knot, the untying of it, it seems. But at the same time, because to every knot there corresponds a truth, but no knot is complete. What does that mean? Well, uh, Chittick states, having actualized the station of no station, perfect human beings recognize that all beliefs are true and all lead to God. They understand the legitimacy of every belief and the wisdom behind every knot tied in the fabric of reality. By accepting each knot for what it is, they learn what it has to teach. And by not allowing themselves to be limited and defined by it, they allow for the untying of every knot. Only by standing in all stations of human possibility, Only by standing in all stations of human possibility and not being defined by any of them can they achieve the station of no station. Some rather large claims are being made. Let's continue with Cheetham, who says, this exalted station lies far beyond any simplistic relativism. And yet the intuition of this possibility lies close to Corbin's heart. Quote, he who is the disciple of Kadir possesses sufficient inner strength to seek freely the teaching of all the masters. Reminds me of the Symphony of Sages through Viveki, but it's kind of like it seems to be that you have to be a disciple of Kadir first, and then you can look to the other people as well. Confusing. The beginning of the ascension is that spiritual birth that gives one access to the imaginal world. And so an increasing capacity for acceptance of forms forever new. I think they're referring to the active presence from the beginning of this series, the initial spiritual birth. I would sort of talk about probably the amnesis of soul and divine double, or again, lower and higher aspects of the soul, the amnesis of that being as this initial sort of spiritual birth, giving access to the imaginal world, where the sort of the capacity for sympathy with nature deriving from that realization would also comport with capacity for acceptance of forms forever new. Sorry. So the eschatology of resurrection must be understood not only as referring to the worlds after death, but to spiritual birth in this world also. And it applies not only to humanity. Quote, every being is in a state of perpetual ascension, since its creation is in a perpetual recurrence from instant to instant. Okay? This cosmology presents a radical challenge to the understanding of the meanings of transcendence and immanence, of creation and imagination, which have molded Western thought. It's not only that there can be no autonomous objects knowable in their concrete and literal opacity. It's not only, anyway, so I should just pause and say that we get a sort of a different form of resurrection here that involves spiritual birth in this world. We get again a focus on imaginal practice and amnesis of the one's imaginal being in a way as a relationship with divine double. We sort of get a reorientation from being to becoming. We also get, what else do we get? We sort of get reimagining of transcendence and immanence, creation and imagination, obviously. And then he says, it's not only that there can be no autonomous objects knowable in their concrete and literal opacity, but the world itself becomes transformed, transparent, eternally permeable to the breath of the compassionate. This world is indeed terrestrial, but not irremediably trapped at the level of the nihilism of mere matter, of a world without presence. Okay, what? It's easy to say these things. Permeability, transparency, capacity for transformation of self and world, presence. Again, a lot being claimed. We get a couple more quotes from Corbin here. He says, if we consider the creature in relation to the creator, we shall say that the divine being descends toward concrete individualizations and is epiphanized in them. Inversely, if we consider these individualizations in their epiphanic function, we shall say that they rise, they ascend toward him. And their ascending never ceases because the divine descent into the various forms never ceases. That is why the other world already exists in this world. It exists in every moment in relation to every being. I get it, but it's difficult to like understand it, to know it. Like how can this be realized? Corbin recounts a conversation with D.T. Suzuki in Ascona in 1954, who says, "We asked him, Suzuki, what homologies in structure he found between Mahayana Buddhism and the cosmology of Swedenborg in respect to the symbolism and correspondences of worlds." I can still see Suzuki suddenly brandishing a spoon and saying with a smile, "This spoon now exists in paradise. We are now in heaven." And that's actually the end of the section. So I'll have to more or less just leave this here. I mean, obviously this part is not the easiest for me, and I would need to do more reading to, but like to me, it's very, like I get it. I get how, like, if we can sort of change our orient, like if we can sort of bring some of these aspects, let's say, or you could say qualities, I don't know how to exactly to put it into, if we can make them available, if we can bring them into view a bit, then relating with them can be quite powerful. And but the question is always going to be for me sort of how to do that. And like to me, it was very easy for me to understand the stuff about time, right? It's like, oh, okay, we can sort of change our way of relating with past and with future and sort of leverage time in that way and relate in step with eternity through imaginal practice and through the eternal, through the archetypal stuff. It's like, great, wow, I get that. But this stuff is like, I don't know. It's like maybe I'm just m more disconnected from this kind of thing, and that's okay. Maybe I'll get to that at some point. I mean, I'm definitely quite a modern person, and it's hard to grok some of this stuff. It's like it's a bit far off in the distance, but which is maybe the point. I mean, the whole point is that it's like this stuff is going on like right now, that it's right here, and then we can just sort of reorient to it, and it's like, oh, it's a different way of conceiving of what's going on now. But it's like, yes, but how to do that? And I don't appreciate the I don't know. I do. I mean, I do appreciate the language, but it's just so easy to just like whiz through all of it, and it's just like, oh, it's like this and this and this and this and this, and it's like, well, okay, but yeah, it was all a bit lost on me, and that's okay. I'll just sort of keep trying to find the bits that resonate and leaving the bits that don't, and it's probably worth including anyway. Again, probably the focus was on the idea was that the relationship between creator and creation derives from is a form of sort of power, distance, and otherness. And this way of reconceiving of things is where, again, God is the created as well as the creator. And this helps us to reimagine transcendence and immanence, creation and imagination. I'll leave it there and continue with the third section.